Yeah, hi, Will Lawrence, Lansing resident, co-founder of Sunrise Movement. Glad to be here with you all. Um, sorry I had to. I'm sorry I had to cancel not do the workshop block, but I've been losing my voice all week, and I really needed to save it for these 50 minutes here. And so I'm going to try to talk softly. It's difficult for me, but if you hear me start squeaking or something, that's what's going on. Um, so I grew up in East Lansing High School, class of '08, and I've been working to understand and address the climate crisis since slightly sooner than that. And it's great to be here with you all today. So we're here for the fate of the Earth, no small thing. I started to worry about the fate of the Earth probably back in about 2003, when I was 13 years old, just before my first year of high school. And I was always a big reader, and a couple of books came across my lap at about that time that really had a big impact on me. One was by Michael Pollan, talking about our industrial agriculture system. It really rocked my world in a big way. It totally changed my view of things, and I remember standing in the kitchen and looking up on the roof of the refrigerator, a box of Cheerios, and just thinking, the Cheerios are a lie. It's all a lie. The Cheerios are a lie. And yeah, the Bummeros, and it was a big bummer. The other book was Bill McKibben, The End of Nature, which was one of the first books written for a mainstream audience about the climate crisis. And he has this haunting last line, and I tried to find it last night, and Google wouldn't let me see the last page, and it's something like, nature is gone, and maybe in 40 or 50,000 years it will return. Is the last line of that book. Of course, now it's become cliche to say, well, nature is actually going to be fine. The Earth is going to be fine. It's us we need to be worried about, and I think that's more accurate. But the book stuck with me nonetheless. And around that same time, the United States was also starting to bomb Baghdad, initiate a war in Iraq. And with all these things combined, I started to really reevaluate my picture of the world that I was growing up into. And my mom is here today. The end result of that process for a little while was that I got very mad at the adults in my life, my parents and my teachers, because it seemed, especially my teachers, to be honest, because it seemed as if they either lacked the information or the courage to have told me the truth about what kind of world I was growing up in as a young man. And that made me very disappointed and angry and afraid. So I entered a rebellious time. We don't need to go into all that, but let's just say that rules and boundaries didn't mean that much to me. Authority didn't mean that much to me, because it seemed as if all the authorities I could see were asleep at the wheel of a car sailing off the cliff. And so I graduated. I went to college, and I started to look back on those earlier years with, I guess, a little bit of regret. And a new phrase entered my lexicon, this idea of teen angst. And I thought, was that what I was experiencing? Was that just some sort of phase or some sort of dysfunction? Was that a period of immaturity? And I thought, I'm kind of past that now. I'm 20 years old. I'm an adult. So then I grew up a little more, and I realized that I had actually been right all along when I was 13. And to be angry, to be indignant, to be confused, to be frustrated, and to be speaking out and even acting out is a perfectly rational response for a young person coming of age in a world in which our moral compass is so evidently broken, in which there is so clearly nobody at the wheel driving us in a rational or humane or compassionate direction as a society. And so because young people have this moral clarity, right, that is a part of our birthright of being human, that we can actually do better, and we all deserve the same basic stuff, and we can have that stuff if we treat each other well. And it hasn't been pummeled or extracted from them yet by a world that says we can't have those things. And so in our immoral society, the moral clarity of youth has long been a driving force for change. All the most significant change we've seen in our history. So that's why I'm proud to still be part of a youth-led movement today that is pushing for a solution to the climate crisis and a more humane, just, and equal world for everybody in this country and around the world. And that's called Sunrise Movement. So Sunrise founders, we're all in our 20s. I'm the oldest actually among us at 28. We have dozens of high school chapters around the country, and some of the strongest leadership on climate change in this country and in the world are coming from people even younger, who are the middle schoolers who are leading the climate strike movement here in the United States and around the globe that have drawn tens of thousands of young people out of classes in this country and millions worldwide. So we're a youth movement and we claim that identity, but there are younger kids coming up behind us, and that's a beautiful thing because that's how change happens. So thank you for indulging me with that brief story of kind of how I came to be here and why I'm proud to be part of a youth movement. And so now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Green New Deal. To start, I'd just like to share what the Green New Deal is and what the foundations are from our perspective at Sunrise Movement. So 3 things. The Green New Deal proposes a 10-year economic mobilization to eliminate heat, what was Emily's phrase? It was heat trapping emissions, global warming emissions, and move towards 100% renewable energy. Number 2, it proposes that the engine of that transition should be a job guarantee program to offer a family-sustaining wage to anybody in the society who wants one. And number 3, because this will be such a dramatic change in the economy, a generational or epochal change in how our economy is structured, we must take the opportunity to invest in and uplift communities that have been extracted from or exploited or left behind under our current economic system, starting with African Americans and other communities of color, including rural communities and more. Because this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It's a structural reform of the economy and society as we know it, and we must take this opportunity to repair historic and ongoing injustices. So those are the 3 basic pillars of the Green New Deal. 10-year mobilization towards 100% renewable energy, powered by a job guarantee, putting racial and economic justice at the center throughout the process. And so I'll get more into all this later, but I'd like to talk about Sunrise's assessment of the ecological and political situation in which we find ourselves, underpinning our call for a Green New Deal that makes us feel that calling for such an ambitious reform is not only necessary, but it's the practical path forward from where we stand right now. And all of this I'm about to go into was informed by a period of deep historical and political study that we undertook over the course of a year, over the course of 2016 and 2017 before Sunrise was launched in April of 2017. And so the starting place for all this is that, again, I know there's been a lot of information discussed today about climate change and the severity. It is an all-encompassing threat. It is far larger and more severe than polite society understands or is willing to discuss in the open, and it threatens to unravel the very fabric of our civilization itself and send us into a new dark age. And so that's a point where I may disagree with Emily. I think there's various paths that we can take, but if you listen to what the climate scientists, and my listening, are actually saying, is if we continue on a business as usual path, this whole thing could start to unravel around us. And one way of kind of that's helped me wrap my mind around this is an anecdote from the recent book that was published by David Wallace Wells, The Uninhabitable Earth, where he talks about the the refugee crisis coming out of Syria that has unfolded over the last 6 years. And he asks, how many people was it that had to flee Syria under threat of violence and death? How many people was it? It was 1 million people. And 1 million people fleeing for their lives out of Syria because of what we must call a racist and xenophobic backlash by European leaders, has created a absolute humanitarian and political crisis across Europe and across much of the sort of Mediterranean. You have a similar situation with other migrants from North Africa. And so that's 1 million, that's the impact that 1 million migrants can have. By 2050, 30 years from now, outer end estimates suggest that we could have as many as 200 million climate refugees worldwide at any one time. 200 million. So imagine the Syrian refugee crisis and all of the impacts that that's had on our geopolitics multiplied by 200. Some people think it could be even higher. But even if it's lower, even if it's just 50 Syrian refugee crises unfolding at once, imagine the kind of world that leaves us in, given the state of our politics today and our baseline inability to deal with these challenges. So that's one thing that really brings it home for me. But even before that, you know, a moment that I had was in probably 2014, after I'd been doing this work for quite some time. I read a book and was reading a book, and it was by a climate scientist, and he told an anecdote about the sort of after hours at the international climate summits. He says, everybody comes to the summits and they say, we're gonna do it here, look at our charts, we can make it happen. And all the scientists, you know, they put on their suits and they put their best face on it, and they show how if we just start doing everything differently tomorrow, it's all gonna work out. And then they go to the bar, and the conversation they have at the bar is, how many people do you think will be living on Earth when this is all settled? Will it be, we've got 7 billion now, will it be 5 billion? Will it be 3 billion? Will it be 500 million people? And this was just the drink conversation that the climate scientists were having, that they do have. So that's the kind of outer end. That's where, it's worth, as David Wallace Wells says, we have to discuss the outer end, because that's business as usual, and business as usual is the path that we're on, and it's the path that we've stayed on since 1975, when we first started to understand the science of this, when the oil companies first started to understand the science of this, and then since 1988, when the United States Congress and the mainstream media started to pick up on that story. And all of that time, we've basically just continued on business as usual, and that's where it's leading us. So that's the foundation for all this. Dramatic and drastic action is absolutely needed and necessary. So that was, you know, and I think lots of people who do this work have some version of what they call the holy shit moment. And it often happens long after you are somebody who understands what's going on. There's a difference between understanding and kind of understanding, you know, at the gut level. So when I heard that story about the climate scientists having drinks, that was my holy shit moment. And if I can create just one holy shit moment for somebody here today, paired with a sense that all is not lost and there might actually be something that we can do about it still, then I will have done my job. So as I know has been discussed throughout the day, what this all means is that we must cut our worldwide emissions in half within the next 11 years by 2030, and completely worldwide in the next 30 by 2050. And I say in the next 30 years rather than 2050, because 2050 to me still sounds very far away. But it's getting closer all the time, and 30 years doesn't sound like that long from now. So in the United States, we actually have a duty to move faster for two reasons. First, because we have the industrial base needed to build the manufacturing capacity that will be needed worldwide to have renewable technologies and various things adopted across the globe. Second, because the United States has recognized that the U.S. and other rich countries have a have a responsibility to do more faster because we are responsible for the lion's share of the historical emissions. And so it would place an undue burden on the global south nations to ask them to move at the same pace when they have not been equally responsible for the problem. So the countries who are the most poised and also the most responsible for fixing this have to move faster. So that means we have to get even more than half of our emissions in the next 11 years and get to 100 sooner than 2050. Though fortunately, we actually have the solutions to do this. New renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuels across the board. It's been cheaper than coal for years, but now, thanks to advances in battery technology, new renewables are actually cost competitive with natural gas, even natural gas, which is supposedly super cheap. Through sustainable farming practices that have been around since the beginning of time and have been carried forward in indigenous communities in many cases, but we're now understanding better at a society-wide level. We can pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it in the soil where it belongs. And just in the last year, as I already mentioned, we've seen huge increases in the battery technology that have been solving some of the thorny issues of getting larger uptake in both renewable energy as well as electric vehicles. We only need to look to any other developed country in the world to see what a modern and sustainable rail transit system looks like. So that really is fully within the realm of technical possibility. So in all of these areas, food, transit, agriculture, manufacturing, energy, you're seeing massive upheaval, positive change. And you talk to people who work in these industries and it's like people's heads are spinning because they're making money, they're growing as fast as they can, things are good. And so in these renewable industries, things are actually very good. We have the solutions we need. And yet, left to the current trends, that transition to an emissions-free world will take 400 years. So we have to do a lot more. We have 30 tops. So what do we need to do that we're not doing yet? The solution is a focused program led by the government of investment to build the stuff we need to remake our energy, food, and transit systems, while also expanding regulations to keep fossil fuels in the ground and end other unsustainable practices. Pretty simple. We just need to say, this, not this. Put the money here, put the manpower here, don't put it here. And the word for this is industrial policy. This has been around for hundreds of years. It's an understood body of policymaking, supporting and protecting and investing in strategic industries, and then creating policy that allows you to organize the workforce and trade and society as a whole to meet those aims. It's really not actually rocket science. And the best example of what this looks like in the modern era is the World War II economic mobilization. Excuse me. So here in Michigan, not a single car was produced from 1942 through close to the end of 1945. Instead, the auto companies switched to producing tanks and airplanes for the war effort, pretty much overnight. And many of the CEOs actually were reluctant to do this at first, but they ultimately did under threat of some consequences from a government that was laser focused on winning the war. And there were also, besides this kind of public-private collaboration that we talk about there were also massive direct investments in the public sector. So we've all heard of the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb. And my vision of this was that essentially a small elite group of scientists, like in a tent, and that was it. Sorry. So the bigger picture is that the Manhattan Project, in addition to those scientists, huddled out in the desert, had 130,000 employees around the country. It was it was a huge coordinated effort of human power, research, intelligence, manufacturing. Again, at the scale of some of our larger corporations, that all was spooled up through the period of 1939 through 1945. And we marshaled between the public and the private sector, we led by the government, but with everybody participating, we marshaled the full creative, technological, intellectual capacity of the country for the distasteful task of fighting with fire, sowing destruction to defeat a genocidal dictator. And there is no reason why we can't do the same for the joyful, enlivening, and also critically necessary task of saving our civilization and ushering in a sustainable society for the 21st century. Why can't we do it? Why can't we do it? Why aren't we doing it? So this is the question that Sunrise's, again, our founders asked ourselves when we undertook this study prior to initiating our movement in 2017. And we realized two critically important things that make up the answer to this question. Why aren't we doing it? Number one, our political institutions are broken. Number two, dominant economic thinking is incapable of solving the problem. So our political institutions are broken, and dominant economic thinking is not up to the task. So let's say a little bit more about each of these. Excuse me. I think Emily hit the nail on the head with this at the end of her talk. And we love her work, by the way, in The Guardian. She's doing great reporting. She said, the Green New Deal is not going to pass Congress anytime soon. That's correct, it is not. Because American democracy is fundamentally undemocratic. For us, the dominant symbol of this is the incredible power of fossil fuel money in politics. We've all heard of the Koch brothers. It's lesser known, they're famous for being evil, but it's lesser known that they're specifically evil through having built a network of oil pipelines and refineries around the country that was initiated by their father. They're actually oil barons. That's where their money comes from. And then they expanded into a whole lot of other industries. But they, through their network, spent $700 million in the 2016 election. Now, the Republican Party spent about $900 million, and the Democratic Party spent just over $1 billion in that election. So you have essentially a third rail of American politics, which is the Koch brothers, and they're driving the agenda across the spectrum. Clearly captured the GOP elites, but they have an incredible ability to influence the ideas and discourse throughout the landscape because of just the sheer weight of what they're spending. But it's not just fossil fuels either. You know, I spent time in Iowa and Nebraska a couple weeks ago, and the thing that really stuck out to me was that my time listening to people in Iowa and Nebraska talk about how it felt to live under the boot of industrial agriculture reminded me so much of the stories I heard from folks in central Appalachia living under the boot of the coal industry, and in southern Louisiana living under the boot of the oil industry. And so corporate control is corporate control, whatever industry it is, but agriculture is a big part of the problem as well. And in many cases, these companies are actually owned by the same people who are in Wall Street. So our campaign finance is a travesty. Politicians represent the donors, not their voters. We know this. It's a disaster. It's a big problem. There's also the matter of the United States Senate. Right? Every state gets 2 senators, regardless of its population, which means that a voter in Wyoming is effectively represented 70 times more than a voter from California because of the relative population of those 2 states. And then there's the filibuster, which gives 41 senators the power to block something which is supported by the other 59. And so this means conceivably that 41 senators representing 37 million people can block something that has the support of all of the rest of the senators representing the other 290 million people in this country. 37 million, 290 million. And often that's kind of how it goes. And so because of these different factors, the influence of corporate money in our politics, and the just broken nature of of the Senate in particular, we craft an immense amount of effort in climate policy asking, how can we craft a policy that would win the support of ExxonMobil and 5 Republican senators? And that is exactly the wrong question to be asking, because the policies that these people support are incompatible with actually solving the problem. If you're seeking their approval, you've given up before you've even begun. And that's just the fact of the matter. And there's a joke that, the Exxon is always in support of climate action, just never any actually existing climate action that happens to be on the table right now. So they've just been playing a long game of stringing people along. And it's the same with the GOP elites in the Senate. I mean, this was the story of Waxman-Markey in 2009. There was all these compromises that were made until there was a bill that was not going to solve the problem, was not inspiring to anybody in the base. You look back now, again, as Emily said, it wouldn't have made a difference at the scale of the problem we're trying to solve. And then in the end, all those people pulled their support out from under it anyway. It didn't even pass. So you can't start asking how we're going to get the support of Exxon and the Republicans. And we also see the logic of the broken Senate sort of showing up in the idea that we need to have a plan that can fit, it can all fit into one legislative package. People say, well, this is a criticism of the Green New Deal. Wow, it's so big. You're reforming the whole economy, sector by sector. How are you going to get that all into one bill? It's going to be 100,000 pages long. And that's a fair critique if you think we're only going to get one crack at it. Again, it's not unreasonable that people think that way because we all saw how that worked with the Affordable Care Act, where you write a 5,000-page bill, you scrap like hell to get it through, and then you basically have to live with it forever because whatever is broken about it is just going to have to stay broken because the Senate's broken, and you're definitely not going to get another bite at the apple to go back and tinker with it, let alone pass another significant reform to go alongside it. But we simply cannot solve climate change that way. It's too big. It touches every sector of the economy. There's no way around it. We can't expect to do this with just one bite at the apple. We have to be able to set the table and sit down for a full meal, like the original New Deal, which was not one piece of legislation called the New Deal. It was like 100+ pieces of legislation that were implemented over the course of a decade. So this means raising the bar about the level of political power that we have to build, because we have to figure out how to set that table and sit down for the full meal. So that's the broken political system. Number two is, I said, dominant economic thinking cannot solve the climate crisis. What do I mean by this? So let me begin by reading you two quotes. First one, the government is not the solution to the problem, it is the problem. Who said that? Ronald Reagan. In his first inaugural speech, 1981. Second quote, the era of big government is over. Who said that? Bill Clinton. When did he say it? It was 1996, his State of the Union. And so Reagan won that. That political contest, and established a bipartisan consensus that smaller government is better. Corporate CEOs can be trusted to make the best decisions for the economy, and that any government intervention, if we have to do it, should take the form of tax incentives or modest tinkering that aren't going to choose winners and losers. This is sometimes called, while we're, by the way, giving massive tax breaks to those corporations themselves. So this is sometimes called neoliberalism is the word that people use for this. And we can't stress enough that this has been a bipartisan consensus about the role of government in shaping the economy. Another great quote is from Margaret Thatcher, who was asked what her greatest accomplishment was. And she said, "My greatest accomplishment was Tony Blair and New Labour, because we made our opponents change their minds. And once they started singing our tune, we knew that we had won for a generation." And the same thing happened here. So this explains a lot, actually, about what kind of solutions have been proposed to climate change. For instance, a carbon tax. Not a bad idea. We should probably have a carbon tax, depending on how it's structured. But it has been presented as the be-all, end-all of climate policy because it fits so neatly within the neoliberal framework. And serious climate scientists will tell you that a carbon tax by itself is simply not up to the task of solving the problem we face, because again, it's massively complex. We're talking about restructuring the entire economy and rebuilding our infrastructure in a very focused amount of time. You just can't do it with this kind of blunt force instrument that is a tax. I mean, another example of this is cap and trade, and we won't even go into that. It's just another example of just really convoluted policymaking that it happens when you kind of cut off a whole side of things. So, because what we actually need is industrial policy in which there are winners and losers, and the losers are the corporations that have profited off pollution for decades, and the winners are the American people. And it's not that complicated. It's really not that complicated. But neoliberalism says you can't do that. So that's the economic orthodoxy that we have to overcome. So this takes us to the Green New Deal. And here's what's so special about it, is that this is the first ever climate policy or climate proposal that has reached this degree of mainstream attention and political support that actually proposes to solve the problem. It is not asking how do we get through the broken Senate as it stands now. It's not asking how do we do it based on what the Chicago School of Economics would suggest. It's asking what is the problem and what is the most straightforward path to solve it using the tools and instruments that the government and we the people have at our disposal. And every prior climate policy that has reached this degree of support up until now was doomed from the start because of unacceptable compromises to fit one of those two conditions. So it does not bow to the economic or political norms of yesterday. It actually understands that we have to change them or face annihilation from climate disaster. That is our choice. We must establish a new common sense about who government is for and what it can do, and that means changing the rules of the game as they currently exist in Washington and putting forward a bold new vision and set of ideas for the future of this country. So you might be probably thinking, you know, this all sounds nice, but what about the broken political system and what about the outdated economic models? How are we actually going to get this done, right? Because these are real barriers. And that's why we need a social movement. That's why we need a social movement. When the moral conscience and urgent attention of the nation is focused on this issue, political reality can transform in a heartbeat. And it's happened before and it will happen again. We've already seen this. The movement that Sunrise and our many allies have built have already changed everything about U.S. climate politics and actually global climate politics, because people all around the world are talking about a Green New Deal in the space of the last 5 months. And we've seen this before in history, where in the original New Deal, there was in a similar period in some sense. We were a period of massively unregulated corporate rule over the economy. This is where the sort of phrase laissez-faire economics came from, was in this sort of the Roaring '20s period leading up to the Great Depression and causing the Great Depression. And at that time, the militancy in the labor movement and in society as a whole reached such a peak that people at the very top believed that they were going to lose control of the country entirely unless something serious changed. They thought, we're going to have a communist revolution in this country, is actually what people were afraid of, if we don't decide to govern the country a different kind of way, and if we don't redistribute, frankly, a massive amount of wealth. And it was the social movement that made that possible. So the only way this is going to happen is through the same path that it took us to get that New Deal, the same path it took to get action for civil rights, the same path that it has taken to move towards LGBTQ equality, for workplace rights and dignity, and for women's suffrage, and for all the other progressive change we've seen in this country's history, through a movement of millions in the street.